Nicolás Guillén. Nicolás Cristóbal Guillén Batista 10 July 1902 – 16 July 1989 was a Cuban poet, journalist, political activist, and writer. He is best remembered as the national poet of Cuba. Born in Camagüey, he studied law at the University of Havana, but abandoned a legal career and worked as both a typographer and journalist. His poetry was published in various magazines from the early 1920s. His first collection, Motivos de Sun 1930, was strongly influenced by his meeting that year with the African-American poet Langston Hughes. He drew from Sun music in his poetry. West Indies Limited, published in 1934, was Gillen's first collection with political implications. Cuba's dictatorial Gerardo Machado regime was overthrown in 1933, but political repression intensified. After being jailed in 1936, Gillen joined the Communist Party the next year. After returning to Cuba, he stood as a communist in the local elections of 1940. This caused him to be refused a visa to enter the United States the following year, but he traveled widely during the next decades in South America, China, and Europe. In 1953, after being in Chile, he was refused re-entry to Cuba and spent 5 years in exile. He returned after the successful Cuban Revolution of 1959. From 1961, he served more than 25 years as president of the Unión Nacional de Escritores de Cuba, the National Cuban Writers Union. His awards included the Stalin Peace Prize in 1954, the 1976 International Botev Prize, and in 1983, he was the inaugural winner of Cuba's National Prize for Literature. Early life. Nicolás Guillén Batista was born July 10, 1902, in Camagüey, Cuba, the eldest of 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls, of Argelia Batista y Arrieta and Nicolás Guillén y Ura, both of whom were of mixed race African-European descent. His father had fought for independence as a lieutenant. When his first son Nicolás was born, the father worked as a journalist for one of the new local papers. He introduced his son to Afro-Cuban music when he was very young. Guillén y Ura belonged to the Partido Libertad and founded the daily newspaper La Libertad to express its views. Government forces assassinated Gillen's father for protesting against electoral fraud and destroyed his printing press, where Nicolás and a brother were already working. Argelia and her children struggled financially. Nicolás and his siblings encountered discriminatory racism in Cuba similar to that suffered by African Americans in the United States. Literary works. Gillen drew from his mixed African and Spanish ancestry and education to combine his knowledge of traditional literary form with first-hand experience of the speech, legends, songs, and songs of Afro-Cubans in his first volume of poetry, Motivos de Sun. It was soon acclaimed as a masterpiece and widely imitated. In the 1920s, when Afro-Cuban sounds and instruments were changing the world of Cuban music, Afro-Cuban culture began to be expressed in art and literature as well. Initially, Afro-Cuban poetry, or Negrista poetry, was mainly published by European Cubans such as Emilio Balaguer, Eligio Carpentier, and José Tollet. It was not until the 1930s that Gillen would appeal in literary terms by expressing a personal account of the struggles, dreams, and mannerisms of Afro-Cubans. Gillen became outspoken politically and dissatisfied with picturesque portrayal of the daily life of the poor. He began to decry their oppression in his poetry volumes Songoro Kasongo and West Indies Limited. Gillen also wrote cantos para soldados y sus para turistas, which reflected his growing political commitment. Gillen is probably the best-known representative of the Poesia Negra Black poetry, which tried to create a synthesis between black and white cultural elements, a poetic métissage. Characteristic for his poems is the use of onomatopoetic words songoro kasongo, mayambam that try to imitate the sound of drums or the rhythm of the sun. Sylvester Revueltas's symphonic composition Sensimea was based on Gillen's poem of the same name and became that composer's best-known work, followed by José Limantour's suite from his film score for La Noche de las Mayas. Gillen later became acknowledged by many critics as the most influential of those Latin American poets who dealt with African themes and recreated African song and dance rhythms in literary form. Gillen made an international mark with the publication of Motivos, de Sun 1930. The work was inspired by the living conditions of Afro-Cubans and the popular Sun music. The work consists of 8 short poems using the everyday language of the Afro-Cubans. The collection stood out in the literary world because it emphasized and established the importance of Afro-Cuban culture as a valid genre in Cuban literature. In Man-Making Words, selected poems of Nicolás Guillén, Angel Aguirre, in reference to Motivos de Sun, wrote that the sun, a passionate dance born of the Negro-white encounter under Caribbean skies in which the words and music of the people culminate in song, is the basic substance of the elemental poetry which Gillen intuitively felt as the expression of the Cuban spirit. He specifically chose the sun as the mixed artistic creation of the 2 races that make up the Cuban population, for the sun in form and content. This quote establishes how the sun, such a profound musical genre of that time, initiated the fusion of black and white Cuban culture. Gillen's incorporation of the genre into his writings symbolized and created a pathway for the same cultural fusion in Cuban literature. Gillen's unique approach of using the sun in his poetry is expressed in his book Songoro Consongo 1931. In this work, Gillen included poems that depicted the lives of Cubans and emphasized the importance of Afro-Cuban culture in Cuban history. Songoro Consongo captures the essence of the Afro-Cuban culture and ways that the people deal with their personal situations. Gillen's poem, La Canción del Bongo, from Songoro Consongo, is a fusion of West African and Hispanic literary styles, contributing to his unique literary vision. Esta es la canción del bongo. Aquí el que más fino si. Respond si lamo yo. Unos dicen ahora mismo. Otros dicen a la voy. Puro mi repique bronco. Puro mi profunda voz. Convoca al negro y al blanco. Que bailan el mismo son. Que pardos y alma prietos. Más de sangre que de sol. Pues quien por fuera no es de noche. Por dentro ya oscureció. Aquí el que más fino si. Respond si lamo yo. En esta tierra mulata. De africano y español. Santa Bárbara de un lado. Del otro lado chango. Siempre falta algún abuelo. Cuando no sobra algún don. Y hay titulos de Castilla. Con parientes en bando. Veil mas calars, amigos. Y no menir la cuestión. Pork venimos de lejos. Y andamos de dos en dos. Aquí el que más fino si. Respond si lamo yo. Habra quien lega en insultarme. Pero no de corazón. Habra quien me escupa en publico. Cuando a solas me besó. At ease le digo. Compadre. Y me pedirás perdón. Y comerás de mi ajiaco. Y me darás la razón. Y me golpearás el curo. Y bailarás a mi voz. Y pasaremos del brazo. Y estarás donde yo estoy. Y vendrás de abajo arriba. Que aquí el más alto soy yo. This poem, like many in Songoro Consongo, incorporates the rhythmic sounds of sun. The poem has a rhythm that uses the marking of stressed and unstressed syllables in strong and weak beats, rather than simply the number of syllables. Delita L. Martin says that La Canción del Bongo stands out as a poem because it is the only one to indicate Gillen's painfully increasing awareness of racial conflicts in Cuba. Langston Hughes and Nicolás Guillén. In 1930, José Antonio Fernández de Castro, publisher of the Havana daily Diario de la Marina, and the first to translate American Langston Hughes's poetry to Spanish, arranged for the two poets to meet. He was a white Cuban from an aristocratic family who loved Black Cuba. He was a newspaperman, a diplomat, and a friend to Cuba's artists. In February 1930, Langston Hughes traveled to Cuba for the second time, on a 2-week mission to find a Black composer to collaborate on a folk opera. He had been given a letter of introduction to José Antonio Fernández de Castro, his door to Cuba's artistic world. At this time, Hughes' poetry was better known to Cubans than that of Gillen, so the American's arrival created a stir in the artistic community. The next month, on 9 March 1930, Gillen published Conversación con Langston Hughes, an article describing his experience of meeting Hughes in Havana. The Cubans expected a nearly white, tall and heavyset man in his 40s, with thin lips and an even thinner English-style mustache. Instead, they saw a 27-year-old, slight brown man without a mustache. Gillen wrote that Mr. Hughes pairs justamente un mulatto cubano looks just like a Cuban mulatto. Gillen was especially taken with Hughes' warm personality and enthusiasm for the Sun music, which he heard on the nightly forays into Cuba's Maranhão district organized by Fernández de Castro. Hughes was said to be a hit with the soneros. His enthusiasm for Cuban music inspired Gillen. Hughes immediately saw the similarities between Sun and the blues as folk music traditions, whose form was based on the call and response structure of African music. Additionally, he was excited about its possibilities as an organic base for formal poetry. According to biographer Arnold Rampersad, Hughes suggested to Gillen that he make the rhythms of the Sun central to his poetry, as the American had used elements of blues and jazz. Hughes drew not only rhythmic innovation from these folk music traditions. Both poets shared anger against racism, but Hughes impressed Gillen with his particular kind of racial consciousness. Although the Cuban poet had expressed outrage against racism and economic imperialism, he had not yet done so in language inspired by Afro-Cuban speech, song, and dance. He had been more concerned with protest than with celebrating the power and beauty of Afro-Cubans. Within weeks of meeting Hughes, Gillen quickly wrote 8 poems that were markedly different from his previous work. His new poems generated controversy and established Gillen's fame as one of the premier poets of the Negritude movement, which spanned the Americas. On 21 April 1930, Gillen sent Hughes the result of his inspiration, his book of poetry Motivos to Sun. The author wrote on the inside cover, "Al poeta Langston Hughes, querido amigo mío. Afectuosamente, Nicolás Guillén." Although Hughes did not find an Afro-Cuban composer to work with, he created a lasting friendship with Gillen. It was based on their mutual respect and convictions about racial inequality. Poetry and politics. Cuba's dictatorial Gerardo Machado regime was overthrown in 1933, but political repression in the following years intensified. In 1936, with other editors of Mediodia, Gillen was arrested on trumped-up charges and spent some time in jail. In 1937, he joined the Communist Party and made his first trip abroad in July 1937 to attend the Second International Writers' Congress, the purpose of which was to discuss the attitude of intellectuals to the war in Spain, held in Valencia, Barcelona, and Madrid, and attended by many writers, including André Malraux, Ernest Hemingway, Stephen Spender, and Pablo Neruda. During his travels in the country, he covered Spain's civil war as a magazine reporter. Gillen returned to Cuba via Guadeloupe. He stood as a communist in the local elections of 1940. The following year, he was refused a visa to enter the United States, but he traveled widely during the next 2 decades in South America, China, and Europe. Gillen's poetry was increasingly becoming imbued with issues of cross-cultural Marxist dialectic. In 1953, he was prevented by the Fulgencio Batista government. After the Cuban Revolution of 1959, Gillen was welcomed back by Fidel Castro, the new president. In 1961, he was appointed as president of the Unión Nacional de Escritores de Cuba, the National Cuban Writers Union, serving for more than 25 years. He continued to write evocative and poignant poetry highlighting social conditions, such as Problemas de Subdesarrollo and Dos Niños, 2 children. He was considered the national poet of Cuba, who drew from its multicultural history and population for inspiration. Nicolás Guillén died in 1989 at age 87 of Parkinson's disease. He was buried in the Colón Cemetery, Havana. Legacy and honors. In 1954, Gillen was awarded the Stalin Peace Prize. It was later renamed for Lenin under de-Stalinization. 1976, he was awarded the International Botev Prize. In 1983, he was the inaugural winner of Cuba's National Prize for Literature. His nephew was experimental Cuban filmmaker Nicolás Guillén Landrian, 1938–2003. Major works: Motivos de Sun, 1930. Songoro Kasongo, 1931. West Indies Limited, 1934. España, Poema and Cuatro Angustias, y una Esperanza, 1937. Cantos para Soldados y Sons para Turistas, 1937. El Sun Entero, 1947. Elegies, 1948–1958. Tango, 1964. Poemas de Amor, 1964. El Gran Zoo, 1967. La Ruta Dentada, 1972. El Diario que Diario, 1972. Por el Mar de los Antillas and un Barco de Papel. Poemas para Niños y Mayores de Edad, 1977. Yoruba from Cuba, selected poems of Nicolás Guillén trans. Salvador Ortiz Carboners, People Tree Press, 2005. Discography. Antologia Oral, Cosa Hispanoamericana del Siglo Roman 20/Oral Anthology, Spanish-American Poetry of the 20th Century, Folkways Records, 1960. Nicolás Guillén, Poet Laureate of Revolutionary Cuba, Folkways, 1982.